welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking from Washington, D.C. The leading story this week continues to be the world economic and financial depression lashing the globe. And as you know, we've been arguing here for the past couple of months, the collapse of Europe, the second phase of the world economic and financial depression that began in September, October 2008, is an uncanny repetition, or parallel at least, to the events of the 1930s. In those days, we had the New York stock panic, October 1929, 1.5 years later, in the midst of many gullible reports that the recovery and the upswing were finally at hand. We had the collapse of the Austrian banking system, followed by the Hungarian one, and then the German one, and then the British one, the biggest one of all in those days, September 1931, the bankruptcy of the British pound, the default on gold payment by the Bank of England, September 21st, 1931. And that's what we're getting this time. We've got the Lehman Brothers panic. We're going to be watching CNBC to see the last days of Lehman Brothers, a dramatization. And we're a year and a half or more from that. And now we've got the collapse of Europe, starting with Greece, but then spreading to Iberia, Spain, and Portugal, and Italy. And that's the Italian story is a big one. Now, interestingly enough, we've got the theoretician of the hedge fund world, George Soros, right? The guy who never starts a speculative attack without having a theory to back it up, right? If he wants to speculate in oil futures, he's got to have peak oil as a theory to use. And if you want to attack Greece, you've got to have a theory that the European construction is inherently flawed. So now he's got a new theory, and it's quite accurate. Up to his policy recommendations, which are not accurate. So here we have George Soros speaking in Vienna at the conference sponsored by the Institute of International Finance. And his line is, the financial crisis is far from over. We have now entered the second act of the global financial crisis, as the fiscal woes of Europe worsen and governments are under pressure to curb their budget deficits. This may push the global economy back into recession. Well, not a recession, it's a depression. It is a ferocious, genocidal depression. Here's the direct quote from George Soros, and I quote, "The collapse of the financial system as we know it is real, and the crisis is far from over. Indeed, we have just entered Act 2 of the drama. Act 2. In other words, the second wave of the world economic and financial depression." Soros said that the current situation in the world economy was reminiscent of the 1930s, with governments under pressure to narrow budget deficits at a time when the economic recovery was weak. And we know that's Brüning, that's the Heinrich Brüning austerity regime. To some extent, also the Herbert Hoover austerity regime. Not quite as bad as Brüning, but getting there. So we've got Soros saying, as the financial markets start losing confidence in the credibility of the sovereign debt, Greece and the euro have taken center stage, but the effects are liable to be felt worldwide. And here's the interesting thing, though. He talks about derivatives. Credit default swaps are addressed by Soros in his oration there in Vienna. And he calls credit default swaps as, he says they're dangerous. They are, quote, a license to kill. Credit default swaps, a license to kill. Probably a good idea, then, that the German government has banned naked credit default swaps, the now famous Leerverkaufsverbot of May 19th, backed up now by bans on naked shorting of German stocks, euro government bonds, and indeed of the euro itself. But here's the thing. all of this is analysis. And one of the things you learn in Washington is a good analysis doesn't commit anybody to anything. As a matter of fact, sometimes a fairly accurate analysis is even used as a cover story for the worst kinds of policy recommendations. So it's when you get to the implementation, the actual policy points, which is something a lot of people never get to, but Soros does. It's only when you get to the actual implementation that you can see what people are actually up to. So here's what Soros says. After calling credit default swaps a license to kill and talking about the second act of the drama of what is obviously a world economic depression, and if he compares it to the 1930s, then he knows that too. Normally you'd then say, all right, full New Deal regulatory regime plus recovery program. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Harry Hopkins, and related issues. No, not Soros. He says, first of all, regulators are not good. Regulators are more imperfect than markets because regulators are always behind the curve and subject to political influences. Of course, bankers and speculators are never subject to political influences, nor do they exercise political influence, dear Mr. Soros, I guess you think. So Soros's bottom line, regulation should be kept to a minimum. Deregulate, privatize. We know that Soros is the great apostle of the poisonous foreign doctrine of free markets, deregulation, and the free flow of hot money across the globe is his number one interest. And if he doesn't like a policy, he'll say, that goes against economic globalization. Yeah, fine. We never voted for economic globalization. I can't find it. I don't find globalization in the Constitution. So there's Soros. The second act of the world economic depression is hitting. We have just entered Act 2 of the drama. Now, that contradicts the Pollyanna line coming from Helicopter Ben. Helicopter Ben Bernanke, the head of the Federal Reserve, this week testified before the House Budget Committee, and he tries to put a good face on things, although even fairly run-of-the-mill commentators on CNBC, Bloomberg, Dylan Ratigan, and elsewhere, they're all getting the idea of what they call the double dip or W-shaped crisis, recession, whatever they call it, whatever euphemism they're trying to use to mitigate the horror of what's actually going on. It's not a recession, it's a depression. Obviously, depressions do not follow a linear descent into the abyss. They go to periodic plateaus and even upturns, certainly, absolutely, especially bubbles forming inside the depression. This is absolutely standard, and that's what you're seeing. Because remember, the activity of the financiers and their political shills and stooges is always to try to promote the relaunching of a bubble. Watch CNBC. That's what they talk about all the time. When can we get another rally? When can we have stocks go up instead of down, or other instruments, depending on what they're selling? So here's Bernanke, and this is basically enough to impeach him right here, because this is the rankest incompetence. This actually, it reminds me of Peter Schiller. Sorry, not Peter Schiller, Peter Schiff. When Peter Schiff told his readers of his newsletters that you could invest in foreign markets and you could have the collapse of the U.S. and your foreign investments would be hunky-dory. That is about as dumb. It's about the same thing that Helicopter Ben is saying. Helicopter Ben's line is, the European debt crisis will have only a modest impact on the U.S. Don't worry about the collapse of Europe. U.S. markets will be dandy. Baloney. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio.